Good morning, thank you, and welcome to Chats with Champions. Before I begin, I'm going to ask if you have any cell phones, pagers, anything that might make noise, to please silence them. I want to acknowledge our Chats with Champions sponsor, Sherman's Main Coast Bookshop and Cafe. And I also want to let you know about another chat that's happening on Thursday. Steve Raymond is going to be talking about senior living choices from Camden to Brunswick. It was advertised as happening at 12 noon. It actually is happening at 10. So if you are planning to come at noon, please try to come at 10. Although because of the widely publicized 12 o'clock start time, he is going to be here at 12 as well. Today's presenter is award-winning author and historian Adam Hochschild. For the body of his work, Adam has received awards from the Lannan Foundation, the American Historical Association, and the American Academy of Arts and Letters. His books have been translated into 14 languages. He's written for The New Yorker, Harper's, The Atlantic, The New York Review of Books, Granta, the New York Times magazines, and other publications, and was one of the co-founders of Mother Jones magazine. Adam teaches at the Graduate School of Journalism at the University of California at Berkeley. What would motivate about 2,800 Americans to fight in another country's civil war, where about 1/4 of them lost their lives? Adam follows the stories of some of these Americans in his new book, Spain in Our Hearts, Americans in the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939. And that's why we're all here. Let me give a warm welcome, please join me in doing so, to Adam Hochschild.
Thank you, Betty. It's great to be here at your wonderful library again. And when I see a terrific library like this that's also next to a good bookstore, you ought to feel lucky that I don't live in Damascata because you'd have me arrested for loitering, going back and forth between one and the other. Anyway, it's a pleasure to have a chance to tell you a little bit about my new book. I'm going to be talking about the Spanish Civil War, but I want to set the background a little bit first. So let's mentally roll the clock back to the 1930s. It was a grim time. Here in the United States, as you know, the Great Depression was taking a terrible toll. A quarter of the population was out of work. More than 30 million Americans had no cash income. Abroad, the Depression was also taking a toll, but especially in Europe, a much more grim one, because these hardships were giving rise to some very nasty movements. Hitler was rising towards power in Germany, finally seized power in 1933. Mussolini had already been in power in Italy since the 1920s. And furthermore, something we often forget is that throughout most of Central and Eastern Europe at this time, there were regimes of the extreme right, usually quite anti-Semitic, semi-fascist, that had taken power or were on the way to power. Fascism was definitely on the rise throughout the continent. As the great French writer André Malraux said, fascism has spread its great black wings over Europe. One bright spot on the continent was Spain. In 1931, centuries of monarchy, mixed with a period of military dictatorship in the 1920s, came to an end. Statues toppled. Elections, real elections, were held for the first time. The king left the country, and Spain became a republic. This was something greeted with great rejoicing, not just in Spain. This picture was taken in Madrid, but everywhere, because democracy seemed to have arrived at last in a country that previously had experienced very little of it. One of the big losers in this change was the Catholic Church, whose hierarchy in Spain was by far the most reactionary in Europe, and which had previously controlled all education in the country. There was still much to be done. Spain was a country of vast disparities of wealth, with a very small, well-to-do elite at the top, and a great mass of miserably poor peasantry at the bottom. Millions of people living in dirt-floored huts with little or no land, and well over a quarter of the population was illiterate, one of the highest rates anywhere in Europe. In fact, the highest rate in Western Europe by far. Progressives in other countries and in Spain itself felt a further surge of optimism in early 1936, when a coalition of liberal and left-wing parties won Spain's national election. And now it appeared that progress could go ahead even faster. The people had spoken, wanted more social and economic justice, and much could be done. A sense of great optimism everywhere over that election victory. Then, however, in July of 1936, a large group of right-wing Spanish army officers rose up against the elected government of the Spanish Republic. They very quickly came under the leadership of a tough-talking young general named Francisco Franco. The Spanish Civil War had begun. This was a shock because this was an open military rebellion against an elected government. And it was the biggest armed conflict in Europe since the end of World War I, nearly 20 years before. These right-wing army officers called themselves nationalists, and they were determined to overthrow the elected government of the Republic. What did they want? They wanted an end to anything that resembled democracy. They wanted a Spain based on large estates in the countryside. They wanted what little land reform had been done to be rolled back. They wanted the supremacy of the army. They made no bones about the fact that this was to be a military dictatorship. There would be no trappings of democracy, no free press, no free trade unions, nothing like that. And they wanted to restore supremacy in many areas to the Catholic Church. And you can find lots of photos like this of bishops and cardinals giving that right-wing fascist salute, along with Franco and his generals. So the Catholic hierarchy was delighted to see the nationalist rebellion against the Republic's government and supported it wholeheartedly. Somebody else who supported General Franco and his nationalists wholeheartedly was Adolf Hitler. There was widespread horror throughout Europe that now Hitler had a new ally, and he began sending help to Franco immediately. Arms, military advisors, ammunition, tanks and planes, and the pilots and crews to man them. For Hitler, the Spanish Civil War was not just a chance to help a sympathetic dictator win power, but it was a chance to try out all of the crucial weapons that he was getting ready for the much larger war he was planning to start, and did start 3 years later. For example, the Messerschmitt 109 fighter plane, mainstay of the Luftwaffe during World War II, was flown in combat extensively for the first time in Spain. Same thing with the Stuka dive bomber. Benito Mussolini not only sent tanks, planes, military advisors, and so on to Franco, but sent 80,000 ground troops as well. So Hitler and Mussolini pitched in wholeheartedly, and this, mind you, is 3 years before World War II began, to try to help Franco and his nationalists seize power. Initially, Franco and the nationalist army officers seized about a third of Spain within 2 weeks after their coup attempt, the areas that are gray on the map. The areas that are red remained under the control of the Spanish Republic. But in a matter of 3 or 4 months, they gained a great deal more ground. and the Republic was really under threat, with close to half the country now in the hands of the nationalist rebels. The Spanish Republic's army fought on, but with great difficulty. They were very ill-equipped. If you look at this photo, for example, the soldiers don't even have helmets. The artillery piece in the background is so ancient that it doesn't even have rubber-tired wheels. The Spanish Republic's army was ill-equipped because most of the officers had gone over to Franco and the nationalists, and they pleaded desperately with the world's major democracies, Britain, France, the United States, for the right to buy arms. And Spain, Republican Spain, actually had the money to buy those arms. Why? Because Spain had fortunately remained neutral during the First World War and had prospered trading with both sides while the rest of Europe was spending its way into bankruptcy fighting that war. But all the democracies closed their doors to Spain. Britain said no, France said no, the United States said no. President Roosevelt was very sympathetic to the Spanish Republic. He certainly hated fascism, but he was a shrewd politician. He felt he had no constituency in the United States in any way for getting involved in a war in Europe, even by selling arms. And, hi Arthur. He said no as well. And finally, the only major country that was willing to sell arms to the Spanish Republic was not another democracy. It was Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. And he demanded a lot in return, specifically high positions for both Spanish and Soviet communists in the Republic's armed forces and its security police. In return for that, he not only sold the Republic crucial arms, especially aircraft and tanks, but supplied the crews to man them. And it was these armaments which really were the crucial force that prevented General Franco and the nationalists from capturing Madrid in the fall of 1936, at which point the war would have been over then. Stalin did something else as well, which is that he passed the word to the world's communist parties to begin recruiting men for the international brigades. This was a multinational force of volunteers, ultimately more than 35,000 men from over 50 countries who came to help defend the Spanish Republic. A remarkable force. Had not really been something quite parallel to it in history. Here are some of these International Brigade volunteers defending the university at Madrid in the fall of 1936. One of the peculiarities of this war was that for most of it, the front line between Republican and nationalist forces ran right through the university campus in Madrid. Some buildings were on one side, some were on the other, sometimes they changed hands. We don't know what countries the men in this photo are from, but given where the early arriving volunteers came from, it was most likely Britain, France, or Poland. And they are defending the university's philosophy and letters building. And if you look very closely underneath the row of sandbags on the left-hand side, you can see stacks of books. British volunteers discovered that if a book was faced outward, a bullet would penetrate roughly 350 pages before stopping. So that's one use for books that may seem too thick to actually pick up and read. Among those 35,000 plus international volunteers, there were some 2,800 Americans. By far the largest group of Americans who've ever gone off to fight in somebody else's civil war. These are American volunteers arriving in Barcelona in early 1937. The volunteers who survived the war are all dead now, but one of the things that made me interested, in fact, that the last known American volunteer to be alive died in March in California at the age of 100. But one of the things that made me interested in writing this book is that I knew a half a dozen of these men, all of them 30 or 40 years older than me, all gone now, but several of them I used to spend a great deal of time listening to their stories of what it was like in Spain. Those American volunteers came from 46 of what was then 48 states. Most, though by no means all of them, were members of the Communist Party or its affiliated organizations. They came from every walk of life, from the son of a former governor of Ohio to a vaudeville acrobat, teachers, lumberjacks, dock workers. Why did they go? I think above all a sense that the greatest threat the world seemed to face at that time was a rapidly expanding fascism, one that would sooner or later threaten all countries. One American volunteer, Maury Colell of New York, said after the war, "For us it wasn't Franco, it was always Hitler." Another, Hyman Katz, a young rabbi who was actually killed in Spain, wrote to his mother several months before he died, saying that if he hadn't come, forever after he would ask himself, "Why didn't I wake up when the alarm clock rang?" Some of these Americans were college students. The man on the right in this photo was from Oberlin College, the other four from New York University. The American volunteers fought in most of the critical battles of the war. Of those 2,800 Americans, 750 were killed, more than 1 out of 4. Hundreds of the remainder were wounded. And that's a death rate, by the way, much higher than the US military suffered in either of the world wars. Some half dozen of those American volunteers were from Maine. Here's one of them. Joseph Dion, 28 years old when he went to Spain. Before then, he came from Lewiston. Before then, he was a seaman. In Spain, he was a machine gunner. Much more about him, unfortunately, we don't know. But we know a little bit about some of the other volunteers from Maine, one of whom was killed in Spain, and one of whom was a woman who worked in the medical unit. The Americans during the war, as I say, fought in the most intense battles of the war. Some of them were in broiling heat. This photo was taken just before the Battle of the Ebro in mid-1938, where the temperature at one point was measured at 98 degrees in the shade, 134 in the sun. They fought another battle at Teruel in the wintertime, where the temperature at one point was measured at 18 degrees below zero. Now, when I write history, I like to try to bring a period of time alive by telling the story through a small number of people who lived through it and whose lives interconnect in one way or another, and whom I can follow through the period of time involved. Several of those in this book are among those American volunteers, and here are two of them. A couple, Bob and Marion Merriman. This photo was taken on their wedding day, 1932, the day that they both graduated from college at the University of Nevada at Reno. Both worked their way through. Bob was also an athlete there, played end on a football team. A couple of months after graduating, they moved to Berkeley, where he became a graduate student and head teaching fellow, eventually head teaching fellow, in the Department of Economics. And I found myself feeling an unexpected sense of personal connection with this couple, because in going through their letters, I discovered that they lived during that time in Berkeley only a few blocks from where I do today. And every time I walk from my house to the Graduate School of Journalism where I teach a class, I walk past the building where they used to live. Bob Merriman became an officer in Spain almost by accident. When he was working his way through college, he discovered that you could earn extra money by taking ROTC, $8.50, which was a lot of money during the Depression. Hence, when he arrived in Spain several years later, he was one of the very few Americans who'd had any kind of military training, whatever. And he almost immediately became commander of the American battalion, and then he was wounded in action, recovered, went back into combat, and eventually became chief of staff of the 15th International Brigade, which was the overall unit that contained all the American, British, and Canadian volunteers, and some from other countries as well. One of the highest ranking Americans in Spain. Widely known, written about by correspondents, respected for a kind of personal charisma and for his bravery in action. His wife Marion went to Spain also, became the only American woman in uniform working at the International Brigade's headquarters, doing clerical work as a corporal in the Spanish Army. Not all of the American volunteers in Spain were soldiers. Some were medical volunteers. For example, the woman in the foreground in this picture, Solaria Key, came from Harlem Hospital in New York. In the American Military Hospital in Spain, she found herself in charge of a ward with 5 white nurses working under her, something that never would have happened in the United States at that time. One of the American volunteers I follow in the book is another medical volunteer, an ambulance driver named James Nugas. And he kept a diary, a wonderful diary. By the way, do historians a favor and keep diaries. It's such good material for us to work from. Nugas was wounded in the war, but he survived. However, he died very young, only about 10 years after coming home. And everyone assumed for decades that his diary was lost. And then, in 2010, someone saw a transcript of it for sale in a used bookstore in Vermont. It's still unclear exactly how it got there, but it was edited for publication, published, and I think it's the finest piece of writing by an American volunteer from this war. Another medical volunteer I follow is a nurse named Toby Jensky, came to Spain from Beth Israel Hospital in New York, and at one point during her work in Spain, she fell in love with a wounded soldier. Now, it's always fascinating when you can reconstruct a love affair from several different angles. And in this case, we have letters from her. Do historians another favor and keep your letters, especially the love letters. We have a memoir by him, and we have an account from someone who knew them both in Spain, who says it didn't happen at all the way he describes it in his memoir. Another group of people I got interested in and picked several, from which I picked several to follow, were the correspondents who covered the war. Here are some of them observing and photographing a bombardment. The war was a huge news story. There were more than, during that whole time it ranged, which was almost 3 years, there were more than 1,000 front page headlines in the New York Times, more than on any other single topic during that period. The re-election of President Roosevelt, the rise of Hitler, the toll of the Great Depression, anything else. It attracted immense attention. And this was so all over the world. There were nearly 1,000 foreign correspondents in Spain. One time or another, one reporter wrote, one volunteer wrote home and said, everybody but Shakespeare is here. And every country sent reporters. Here are some of them, one group of reporters in a trench. And in the middle, as he always managed to be in the middle of every group he was in, is, of course, Ernest Hemingway, the most famous of the correspondents. He reported the war for the North American Newspaper Alliance, a consortium of some 50 newspapers. Also in Spain with him was his then lover, later third wife, Martha Gellhorn, writing for Collier's magazine. And those of us who've worked in the magazine business are envious when we read that in the 1930s, Collier's had a paid circulation of 9 million. In this photo, she is with Bob Merriman from Berkeley on the left, whom I was telling you about. Now, for the Correspondents, they covered the major battles of the war, and more than anything else, they wrote about the bombing of Madrid. This was the city where they were based, and this was the first time that a major European capital had come under heavy, sustained, month after month, aerial bombardment. It was a huge story. They wrote hundreds of thousands of words about it. Now, I've sometimes reported from abroad myself, occasionally from conflict zones. And one thing I've noticed about large groups of journalists in such places is that we, often tend to practice a kind of herd behavior. We tend to point their notebooks and camera lenses at the same thing and to write the same kinds of stories. In Spain, there was all the more incentive to do so because all the foreign correspondents covering the war on the Republican side stayed at the same hotel in Madrid, the Hotel Florida. They ate dinner together every night in the same restaurant a couple blocks away where there was a long table reserved for the foreign press. Afterwards, they would repair to Hemingway's suite at the Hotel Florida and drink till the early hours of the morning. And they kept a close eye on each other and tended to report the same stories. And anybody who's ever been in the newspaper business will know that there's a reason for this. The last thing that any correspondent, newspaper, radio, TV, anything else, wants to get when in the field is a message from an editor back home saying the other paper or the other network is reporting this or that, and why haven't we heard anything about it from you? So in a situation like that, looking back on it 80 years later, the question for me becomes, what stories did they miss? And in Spain, there were two big ones. One of them got a minuscule amount of coverage during the war, one absolutely none at all. Here's the first. In most of northeastern Spain, Franco's military coup was initially defeated not by loyal soldiers, but by hastily organized, badly armed militias set up by left-wing political parties or trade unions. Some of these included women, and when these militias defeated the nationalist grab for power, these worker-controlled militias essentially found themselves in control of large swaths of the Spanish Republic. The workers were a mixture of socialists, communists, and above all, anarchists, a tradition that was very strong in Spain, even though, paradoxically, it had died out almost everywhere else in the world. And over a period of some months, they carried out the most far-reaching social revolution ever seen in Western Europe. Workers took over factories and sometimes converted them to making badly needed munitions at the front, like this homemade armored car made by these auto workers in Barcelona. The Ford and General Motors plants got taken over by their workers. Railway workers took over the train system in the Northeast. That's the initials of the anarchist trade union federation on the side of the locomotive. Peasants took over these large estates where they had once worked as laborers. In Barcelona, before the war, the city's fanciest hotel was the Hotel Ritz. Here's its restaurant. It got taken over by its cooks, waiters, and busboys and converted to People's Cafeteria No. 1 for the poor. The foreign correspondents in Spain almost entirely ignored this social revolution. They seldom wrote about it. They were too busy trying to keep up with each other reporting the bombing of Madrid. So in the book, I take you through Spain's social revolution, through the lives of two young Americans who happened to find themselves in the middle of it. This is the photograph page from their joint passport. Lois and Charles Orr. Lois was a student at the University of Louisville in her hometown, Kentucky. Charles, who was about 10 years older than she was an instructor in economics there. They got married in the spring of 1938. They were leftists, but of a very independent anti-Stalinist variety. And they set off for Europe on their honeymoon. They were traveling on their honeymoon in France and Germany when they got word of the attempted military coup in Spain and of this extraordinary social revolution that seemed to be taking place in the Northeast, which they were very excited by. Lois, who was very much the live wire of this couple, insisted to her somewhat older, somewhat stodgier husband that they go to Spain. They hitchhiked to Barcelona. They lived and worked there for 10 months. Lois Orr was 19 years old. She wrote the most extraordinary series of letters home during this time, plus an unpublished memoir that she spent years writing and rewriting and was never able to publish. It was a high point of her life. They met other young idealists from all over Europe who'd come to Barcelona to see this social revolution, which people were excited by because it seemed to be the kind of long dreamed of revolutionary upheaval that this time was coming from the bottom up and not imposed harshly from the top down as it happened in the Soviet Union. So there were other young idealists from all over Europe flocking to Barcelona at this time. One of them, for example, was a 23-year-old German political refugee named Willy Brandt. Another became still more famous. Here he is at the far left-hand end of the line in the militia unit that he joined in Barcelona, and he is, of course, George Orwell. I'm sure some of you have read Orwell's wonderful memoir of his time in Spain, Homage to Catalonia. Let me just read you a couple of sentences from it in which he describes his first immersion in this revolutionary city. Waiters looked you in the face and treated you as an equal. Servile and even ceremonial forms of speech had temporarily disappeared. Nobody said "Signor" or "Don." Everyone called everyone else "comrade" and "thou." Almost my first experience was receiving a lecture from the hotel manager for trying to tip a lift boy. All this was clear and moving. I recognized it immediately as a state of affairs worth fighting for. Almost no mention of any of this by the foreign correspondents covering Spain. Now, there was another story that the correspondents ignored even more totally. A modern military runs on oil, like these tanks, which were tanks that Mussolini had given to General Franco. Tanks run on diesel fuel, trucks run on diesel or gasoline, aircraft require aviation fuel, and so on. You can't fight a war in the 20th century without oil. And 60% of the oil going to Spain during this time was going to fight the war. All the time, those correspondents were writing about the bombing of Madrid. They never looked up at the aircraft bombing them and asked what should have been an obvious question. Whose fuel is powering those planes? Here's why it should have been obvious to ask that question. Nationalist Spain had no oil wells. Germany and Italy, which were sending it this large stream of arms and ammunition and so on, were oil importers, not exporters. They could have put up money for Franco to buy oil on the world market, but it would have been a very expensive proposition. Moreover, if you went to buy oil on the world market, the chances at that time were that it most likely came from the United States, especially the state of Texas. And America was not selling arms to either side in Spain, and U.S. neutrality legislation was very strict. And it said even if you were selling to a country at war something that wasn't arms, but was something else like food or oil or whatever, It could not travel in American ships, and nationalist Spain had no oil tankers. And it couldn't be sold on credit. And nationalist Spain was very short of cash, because remember, the Republic had gotten the gold. However, this was not a problem, because Franco had a great admirer who was the head of a major American oil company. His name was Thorkild Rieber. He's a major character in this book, very little known. He was a man who loved dictators, whether Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, later in his life, the Shah of Iran. Thorkild Rieber was CEO of Texaco. And then, like today, oil companies tended to make their own foreign policy. And Rieber happily sold the nationalists most of their oil. He sold it on credit, which was a violation of US law, and he sold it to them at a huge discount, something which he never told Texaco shareholders about, or, as far as we can tell from the minutes of their meetings, he never even told his own board of directors about. I mentioned that the Spanish nationalists had no oil tankers. Not a problem. Texaco, happily for Franco, had one of the world's largest fleets of ocean-going tankers. And in another violation of US law, Rieber shipped Texaco oil to nationalist Spain on Texaco tankers. What would happen is that the tankers would load up at the Texaco pipeline terminal in Port Arthur, Texas. When customs agents would get on board, they'd be shown paperwork showing the ship bound for Rotterdam or Amsterdam or Antwerp. And then at sea, the captains would open sealed orders redirecting them to ports in nationalist Spain. So those bombers over Madrid were fueled by Texas oil. And that's not all. Rieber was such an enthusiast for Franco that he went to nationalist Spain twice during the war. And on one of these occasions, he got a VIP tour of the front lines by aircraft. That's Rieber's second from the right. The man at the far left, appropriately wearing a black hat, is another Texaco executive. His name was William Brewster, and he was head of Texaco's Western European operations, based in Paris. And Rieber and Brewster put Texaco at Franco's service in an additional way. Now, being a major multinational oil company, Texaco had offices, oil tanks and installations, agents in ports all over the world. And Rieber and Brewster sent out information, sent out telegrams to all these people saying, alert us immediately by telegram anytime you pick up any information about oil shipments heading for the Spanish Republic. Oil companies tend to know what their competitors are doing, as in any business, and of course it's very hard to disguise an oil tanker taking on cargo somewhere. And in ports, people know where the ships are heading for. And the information about oil tankers heading for the Spanish Republic was very useful to the nationalist high command, to whom it was passed on immediately as it came in, because this told bomber pilots and submarine captains where they might be able to find targets. Over the course of the war, 29 oil tankers carrying oil to the Republic were sunk, damaged, or captured. Here's the story of one of them that met its end thanks to information supplied by Texaco. This is William Brewster writing to following up by letter information he'd already sent by telegram, writing to the head of the Nationalist Oil Company, July 2nd, 1937, about a tanker bound for the Spanish Republic that was temporarily anchored off a French port near Bordeaux. And you can see at the beginning of the letter, he gives the name of the tanker, the SS Campo Amor, says it's fully loaded with a cargo of gasoline, and then gives the kind of identifying details as just what a submarine captain looking through his periscope would like to know. Her name and port of registry have been painted out, her hull and funnel are now painted black. The ship is taking on food, which seems to indicate an early departure. Here's the separate document included in this letter. It came from Texaco's men on the French dock, which gave some additional information, namely that most of the tanker's crew goes ashore each evening, as long as it's tied up in this port. Here's the ship, the SS Campo Amor. 4 days after that information was sent by letter and telegram, during the evening, when most of the crew had gone ashore, the ship was boarded by a nationalist raiding party, captured, and sailed to a port held by nationalist Spain. So the United States, the history books will tell you the United States was neutral in this war, but Texaco had gone to war. Well, with that kind of help from Texaco and continued heavy support from Hitler and Mussolini, the nationalist forces continued to gain ground. You can see the gray area on the map is even larger than it was in those earlier pictures. We're now in late 1937. And as you can see, you don't have to think too hard to see where the next attack is going to come, because there's one finger of that gray nationalist territory which comes quite close to dividing the Spanish Republic in two. And indeed, in March of 1938, it was right at that spot where the nationalists launched the largest offensive of the war, heavily supported by German and Italian planes and tanks, lots of Italian troops, driving towards the Mediterranean, aiming to split the Spanish Republic in two. The Republic's forces, which included the American units, were right near that spot, were vastly outnumbered and overwhelmed. They were forced into a long, disastrous retreat. Tens of thousands of casualties overall. Hundreds of Americans were killed, wounded, or captured during this time. And after 5 weeks of fighting, the nationalist forces reached the sea, and the Spanish Republic was split in two. The war would last another 10 months, but it was pretty clear at this point that the Republic was doomed. 500,000 Spaniards, men, women, and children, fled, not wanting to live under nationalist rule, fled across the Pyrenees into France in early 1939. And by April of that year, the war was over, and Franco celebrated his victory in Madrid and remained dictator of Spain for the rest of his life, 36 years. Because this is a book about Americans in the war, I'm going to finish by coming back to some of those American volunteers who went to Spain and show you pictures of just a few of them who didn't return. Norman Lisberg, a carpenter from Louisiana, killed at Teruel. That was a battle fought in the deep, deep snow and cold, January 1938. James Lardner, a journalist for the New York Herald Tribune, who left his post to become the last American to volunteer in Spain, came from a very famous literary family. His father was Ring Lardner, the humorist, the last American to enlist, one of the last to be killed. Samuel Willis, a laborer from Philadelphia, a scout and runner in Spain, killed in action March 17th, 1938, on that disastrous retreat that spring. Abraham Chaikin, wrestling coach at the City College of New York, went missing in action the same day as Willis, also on that retreat. And finally, Bob Merriman from Berkeley, whom I told you about before, whose story threads through the book, and who was last seen alive April 2nd, 1938. And when I went to Spain while writing the book, I went to the place where he was last seen alive, trying to break his way out of a nationalist encirclement on that retreat. It's a lovely scene today. Vineyards, olive groves, red terracotta roofs on those villages. But on that day in 1938, it was a grim one. Merriman was leading a group of the Republic's troops, American volunteers, Spaniards, some from other countries as well, coming from sort of behind where we're looking here. They reached this hill at dawn knowing the nationalist forces were on their heels. They knew that if they could get across this valley and over that range of hills on the other side, they would reach territory held by the Republic and they'd be safe. But when they reached the hilltop at dawn, they realized that Franco's troops were coming down the road into the valley from one side, a group of Mussolini's Italians were coming in from the other side. They saw that they were surrounded. There were spotter planes overhead. They broke into smaller groups and tried to slip across the valley when night fell, but most of them didn't make it. If, by the way, Merriman's story seems at all familiar to you, a tall, athletic, former university instructor from the American West who loses his life in Spain, it's because Ernest Hemingway very clearly had him in mind when Hemingway wrote his novel For Whom the Bell Tolls about Spain. And there are many characteristics of the hero, Robert Jordan, which resemble Merriman. So I think we'll stop right there. I'd be glad to hear your questions or comments. But before I do, I have one question for you. Did anybody here have a relative who fought in Spain? I always ask that, and most of the time there is. So I was just curious. I thought I would see if I had one. So, yeah.
Was there anything that distinguished the American volunteers from the others? I knew a fair amount about the war because of the Civil War, because of Orwell and other volunteers from England and France. And I always had the impression that Catalonia was where the Trotskyists, the anarchists, and so on were fighting. Orwell complains about the lack of assistance from the communists in controlled regime in Madrid. So it would seem that there might have been a disparity between those who gravitated toward Madrid and those who went to Barcelona.
So the question was about the distinctions between the different kinds of volunteers who went to Spain. The communist organized volunteers, the international brigades, were, as I said, between 35 and 40,000 men. And these were essentially organized by the Communist International in Moscow and communist parties of various countries. And they, in the initial months of the war, fought almost entirely around Madrid, in the battles for Madrid. Where Orwell was fighting, in the territory near Barcelona, that part of the country was where the anarchists and a smaller party whose militia he joined, the POUM, that was allied with them, that part of the country was where they were by far the strongest. And so of the estimated 4,000 or 5,000 non-communist volunteers who went to Spain to fight but had not been organized to do so by the Communist Party, almost all of those did go to Barcelona, did go to Catalonia and fight there. There was not as much military action going on that part of the front for the first year of the war, and indeed in Homage to Catalonia, Orwell makes this clear. There's really only one moment in the 4 months he was at the front where he actually takes part in a raid. And in fact, ironically, even though he was by no means a communist, he was trying to transfer to the international brigades when he came to Barcelona on leave in May 1938, hoping to enlist in the international brigades because he felt that despite the fact that it was run by the Communist Party, it was Madrid where the real fight was. Then he got caught up in this internecine fighting that took place in Barcelona and was deeply disillusioned by the fact that the communist-controlled police forces were out in the streets fighting against the anarchists and the POUM people. And so he decided to go back to the militia unit that he had come from, and that's where he was when he was wounded about a month later. Yeah.
What was your initial reason, or where did you come upon the idea of the Texaco connection? What was your, what brought that to your mind and into the book?
You know, I often find my best leads in somebody else's footnote, and if you read any standard book about the Spanish Civil War, like Hugh Thomas's massive 1,000-page book called The Spanish Civil War, or especially if you read an economic history of the Spanish Civil War, you'll usually find people saying in one sentence in passing, or in a footnote, Franco bought most of his oil from Texaco. And sometimes they'll give you a few numbers, but it's never more than a sentence or two. And I got curious about this. Why Texaco? Who was head of Texaco at that time? Was it somebody with special, some special sympathies? How did this come about? And I began looking and looking and looking, and turning up more and more interesting details, and realized that this guy, Reber, had been written about a good deal by journalists at the time. He was just the kind of person that journalists love to do profiles of, because he had worked his way up to become CEO of Texaco after starting out as a sailor. He was Norwegian born, although in his 20s he became a naturalized American citizen, sailed on clipper ships around Cape Horn before going on steamships. Then he happened to be a commander of a tanker that Texaco purchased, and he realized that big money was to be made on shore. He came ashore, married his boss's secretary, and worked his way up quite rapidly. But he made a great deal during his life of this sort of sailors up from the lower decks persona. But the other material, like the business about this secret supply of intelligence that Texaco gave Franco, this was discovered by a Spanish scholar, Guillen Martinez Molinos, written about in two obscure articles published in Spain. As I came across them, I got in touch with this man who very generously shared his documents and so on with me. Virtually no historians have noticed what he's written, and to me it's a fascinating story, and it is amazing that it has not been told more prominently in the 80 years since that war began. Yeah.
Do you think Texaco did this without the knowledge of our government?
Our government, I spent a lot of time looking into U.S. government records, plowing through stuff at the FDR Presidential Library in Hyde Park, plowing through the papers of Roosevelt's Attorney General at the time. Our government knew a little bit about what was going on. They knew that Texaco was somehow supplying some sort of credit to the nationalists, and they knew that their customs agents were being presented with false papers by Texaco's ship captains. They didn't know about the oil being sold to nationalist Spain at below market rates, and they knew nothing about this whole intelligence operation. Roosevelt was very wary of getting involved, appearing to take sides in the Spanish Civil War. It's widely believed, although nobody can prove it because for obvious reasons it's one of these promises that never got written down, it's widely believed that in the prior to the 1936 elections, he promised the hierarchy of the American Catholic Church that he would not get involved in Spain in any way. And evidently he considered going after Reber publicly would be a violation of that pledge, because he didn't do so. Texaco got a minor little wrist slap of a fine, $22,000 from the Justice Department. That was it. At one point, in a cabinet meeting, when some of this stuff came up, Roosevelt, of according to his attorney general who was there, declared himself in favor of vigorous prosecution, but then he changed his mind.
Popeye makes a very small appearance in your book. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, you're referring to sort of the iconography picked up by people in revolutionary Barcelona. This is in the marvelous account that this young woman, 19-year-old woman, Lois Orr, left in her letters from that city. And she's talking about, here she is going, expecting, she's going to the absolute epicenter of the workers' socialist revolution, where at last the working class is in control and is going to run society the way radicals had always hoped it would be run. But instead she finds they've adopted the American commercial Popeye as a sort of mascot who appears everywhere, that a lot of the men are wearing bright neckties with naked women on them, that the houses of prostitution are doing just as big booming a business as ever. But when she complains about it, the people involved say, well, we've thrown out the madams. So it's part of this the world turning out to be quite different than she expected to find it. Yeah.
You made two historical comparative judgments that I wonder if you might revise. One is about the events in northeastern Spain being the major social revolution in history, and I'm wondering how you would compare that to the events in Portugal in 1974, 1976, for example. And the other one would be the fact that there's no parallel to the international brigades, and how you would look at the jihadists today in comparison with that.
Well, I thought what happened in northeastern Spain was the largest social revolution in Western Europe that had taken place at that time. I'm not as familiar with what happened at the time that the Salazar regime fell in Portugal. Did it extend to workers taking over factories?
Absolutely. There was really a dual power situation for really over a period of a year. Workers' control was extremely widespread.
And land ownership also?
Yes, the appropriation of estates.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I'll have to revise what I say about that point. I look forward to learning more about it. As to the comparison to the jihadists today, yes, there is a sort of international aspect to that. This is by no means the only time in history when thousands of people have gone to a different place to join in some kind of civil war. There are plenty of times like this, before and after. I mean, after all, Europeans like Lafayette came to the United States to join in our war of independence against England. Thousands of people from England went to fight for the independence of Greece in the early 19th century. Lord Byron, the poet, died there. Thousands more came and fought beside Bolivar in South America. And there have been many such crusades going back to the Crusades. Crusades both religious and political, before and after. As we look back over all of them, some of them, I think, look, in retrospect, worth fighting for. I mean, whatever faults we may find with the United States, I think it was a good thing that we became independent from England. Some of them, I think, look worth fighting for. Some of them, especially most of the religious wars of all sorts, to me seem in retrospect not worth fighting. But I think the war in Spain, Spanish Civil War, was one where I very much wish that the Spanish Republic had won. I think history might have unfolded somewhat differently as a result. It would mean, for example, that, well, it would mean, first of all, that the people of Spain would not have had to endure a very harsh 36-year dictatorship under Franco. It would also mean that Hitler would not have had Spain as a de facto ally for the first couple of years of World War II. Spain was a very important supplier of strategic minerals to Germany throughout the war, gave Hitler a submarine base on the Atlantic coast, which was thousands of miles closer to convoy routes than the bases he otherwise would have had. 22 submarines were based there. Lots of Allied servicemen lost their lives to those submarines. And Franco also supplied 45,000 volunteer troops to fight with Hitler in Russia. So I still think the Spanish Civil War was worth winning. Ron?
So you say in the beginning of your book that you asked the question, what would you have done if you were in that period of history? Can you answer that question?
Well, I hope I might have been brave enough to go and fight in Spain. If I knew everything that I know now, that more than 1 out of 4 of the Americans were killed, that even those who survived had a pretty miserable time living on mule meat and rancid olive oil and so on, I'm not sure how exciting an experience it would have been. But I honor the people who went, and I think they fought for something good. Yeah. Yeah.
Did you encounter in your research any church groups in the U.S. that supported the Republic? I understand the Catholic hierarchy didn't, but oftentimes they'll be organizing efforts, well, at least now.
Yeah. Yes, there were some. They were doing things like raising medical aid, funds for children's nutrition and so on, because the Republic was very badly pinched for supplies of all kinds. And of course you couldn't raise money for arms in the United States anyway, but there were church groups who were definitely involved in raising funds for milk for the children of the Republic, so on. The Quakers were involved in that. Eleanor Roosevelt herself made a contribution. Yeah.
What happened to the president of Texaco after?
After the war, Reber survived the Spanish Civil War totally unscathed by his relationship with Franco, but his propensity for loving dictators got him into trouble a year after the war ended. He had hired a number of Nazis to work at Texaco, and in 1940, which was during this peculiar twilight period when World War II had begun in Europe, but the United States was not in the war, so there was still, trade and diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Germany. It turned out that one of these Nazi Texaco employees in New York was using the company's communication system to send messages to a Texaco employee in Berlin, and the messages were about reports on the American aircraft industry, reports on ships leaving New York Harbor, heading for Britain, and so forth. British intelligence got onto some of this, probably by eavesdropping on the transatlantic cable, which I think ran through Bermuda. And they leaked the story to the New York Herald Tribune, which banner headlined it. Reber was forced to resign, and it was a big disgrace for Texaco, which then, with the advice of a high-priced public relations consultant, moved to clean up its public image by beginning to sponsor the Metropolitan Opera broadcasts weekly. A relationship which lasted for decades. So Reber lost his job, but he landed on his feet because General Franco made him chief American buyer for Spain's national oil company. And he went on to a series of other high-paying posts and directorships in the business world and the oil world after that. One one more question. Okay.
Mine's a simple one. I just, you referenced the letters of Ms. Orr. Are those published or available to the general public?
The letters,
I believe it was Louise Orr.
Lois Orr,
Lois
yes.
Orr.
Lois Orr, yes. They appear, a wonderful selection of them appear in a book that is simply called Letters from Barcelona. Unfortunately, it is published in England. It never received a single review in an American newspaper or magazine. You need to find a good university library to get a copy of it, but it is well worth reading. It's really quite an extraordinary compilation.
Thank you.
Adam will be signing books, and I'm sure would be happy to answer more questions in our lobby. Thank you so much, Adam. You truly make history come alive for someone who is not a very happy person who had to study history in college. I enjoy reading your books very much more than my experience in school. Thank you very much.